Now it is time for the big finish, and Celina de Sola is the big finisher. She's positively impacted more than 1.5 million lives since 2007. Her nonprofit Glasswings addresses education programs and health and mental health programs. She's a winner of the Skoll Social Entrepreneurship Award in 2020, the first Latin American grantee of the Audacious Project 2021-22 that addresses the root causes of poverty, violence, trauma, and migration in the Americas. She's here today to talk about unlocking the potential and peace in communities through improved mental health. Celina de Sola creates opportunities for children. Please welcome her to the stage. Celina. Thank you so much. Good luck.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking around. I'm the last one here and really excited and honored to be here. I'm here to talk about basically how if we amplify access to mental health, we really can unlock potential and we can interrupt cycles of violence that we're seeing in so many communities around the world and hopefully sustain peace. A lot of people might not know this, but Latin America is home to only 8% of the world's population, but about a third of its homicides. So this is especially extreme in certain countries and countries in Central America, the region that I'm from. And imagine what this can mean, right, for individuals and communities to be exposed to this kind of unrelenting violence. Especially because if we're exposed to violence, this can result in trauma. And when that happens, our brain's stress response shuts down some of our core functions like problem solving, critical thinking, emotional regulation, and then it has to elevate the ones that we need to protect ourselves and survive. So this makes it hard for us to learn, for children, for adults, for all of us to learn, to make decisions, to maintain relationships. And so many communities, and I'm sure you can think of many, so many individuals now are facing that more and more, and perhaps we're talking about it more, stress, anxiety, depression among young people. So we have to consider what happens when this individual and collective stress and trauma collide in our societies. So I'm from El Salvador, and for the past 18 years, we co-founded 18 years ago this organization that does basically, what we do is we try to keep kids away from violence and enable them to thrive. And we do this through different kinds of programs in schools and communities. And we also do evaluations, and I'm not a scientist like most of the people who have spoken today, but we do a lot of research with the World Bank and other partners to make sure that what we're doing is actually generating the impact we want, or when it doesn't, also share this information with policymakers and our peers. And we have, now we're working in 12 countries, we have about 700 employees and thousands of volunteers, so it's really exciting. But before we started Glasswing, that's me in the middle, even though I kind of look like the girls around me at the time. It was a while ago. Before starting Glasswing, I was actually a humanitarian aid worker. And my focus was leading responses to crises in countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, the Darfur crisis in Sudan, and other locations that were facing really, really extreme adversity. And I had to say, the learning curve was unbelievable, right? And the people that I'd come across, teachers, healthcare workers, community leaders, every day, and I was in my 20s, every day was this incredible learning curve and just exchanges that really taught me a lot about just people, about resilience, about hardship. But I think I want to share two experiences that stand out because they're kind of what got me thinking more about grief and about loss and about trauma. So this is a picture I took in Liberia. I was working there in 2003, right after Charles Taylor was ousted. And the UN was working to demobilize and rehabilitate and reintegrate child soldiers. And I do remember one of the kids that I was speaking to, a teenager he was holding, and they were bringing their weapons to kind of give them back or hand them in as part of this process. And I remember we were talking and he's like, this gun is everything I have. This gun is my mom, it's my father, it gets me food, and it keeps me safe. Right, so, those things that really stick with you. And one of my trips here, I think that the subsequent trip I took, we were taking a drive with Dr. Sando. He was a physician, one of the few physicians that had stayed in Liberia. And it was in a kind of a similar context. And we were driving out from Monrovia. The peacekeeping troops weren't outside of Monrovia at the time. And we drove out to see a hospital that had been destroyed. And about an hour and a half out, and the roads were all covered in vines and grass. And about an hour and a half in, we got waved down by these child fighters, right? Child soldiers. And they were like little kids. It's like little kids playing war almost. It was this crazy scene, right? One of them even had an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, just holding it. And they waved us down and they stopped us because at the time they were kind of controlling the different territories. So the Liberian gentleman who was driving us, he was right in front of me, stopped the car and stared straight ahead. He didn't make any eye contact with these young kids. And one of them comes up to my side of the window. I was right behind the driver and kind of taps my window with his weapon, like tap, tap. And of course, my immediate reaction was to open the window and engage. I didn't want to ignore him. I didn't want him to feel like I was ignoring him. So I rolled down the window, and then he gives me the Liberian handshake, which has like a snap at the end. It's just, kind of a really friendly handshake. And he says, "Do you have a ciggy?" And I was like, I don't. Luckily, I knew what a ciggy was. Man, like, I'm sorry, I don't smoke. I don't have any. Sorry about that. But I did talk to him. And he's like, "All right, no problem." And then he kind of shrugged and walked back to the other group. And they couldn't have been older than 17, right? They were all different ages. So he walks back, and a few moments later, they let us pass. And then the driver, after we passed, he looks in the rearview mirror, and he's like, "Don't ever do that again. Don't ever do that. You could have gotten all of us killed." So of course, I haven't stopped thinking about that for the past 20 years because you're like, I could have gotten all of us, there were 4 of us in the car, killed. And it's only after I learned, after many years of studying trauma, of studying mental health, that I learned that we were reacting based on, the reactions we had were based on our experiences in life, right? So his experiences, and the reason he was silent and not engaging is because the experiences he had had before in this context led him to understand that if he engaged, it would be more risky than if he stayed quiet. And I was reacting based on my experiences. And I also felt threatened. We both felt threatened, but my reaction was based on my experiences in my life and how I had engaged before in situations of risk or not. So it was almost like reflecting on this same exact situation, 2 people in the same situation, 2 totally different reactions. And I think, obviously I hadn't been living through decades in Liberia of brutal violence and conflict. And I think just thinking about the interplay of your survival instincts, your fight, flight, freeze, and then kind of your rational being, right? Your rational thinking. So much of that is, your reactions are really a combination of all these things you've experienced in your life. It's like they're dictated by the sum of our experiences. And I have to say, I'll never understand what he went through, what he goes through, but it did make me reflect really deeply. It's obviously really humbling. And I did start to wonder that every trip, every place I went to, as we were running around as humanitarian aid workers, doing our best to get humanitarian aid there, medical relief, shelter, vaccines, whatever it is we had to do, were we considering, and this is 20 years ago, obviously things have changed, but at the time, were we actually asking anybody what it is they needed for their well-being? Like, did we ever stop to think about, I know we need this to keep people healthy, but what is it that people need for their well-being? And I think that we probably weren't, right? We probably weren't asking that, like what they needed, because we weren't leaving space for them to process or cope or heal. A year later, now it's 20 years, right? A year later, the tsunami happened, and I was deployed to Banda Aceh, which was the hardest hit part of the world by the tsunami. And, it was one of the most intense experiences to see that. Boats and ships on top of buildings, so much lost life. And I remember we had to hire so many people to offload plane loads and plane loads of humanitarian aid. And in that emergency, people had died or they had survived. There wasn't as much injury or infectious disease as we all had expected. So we were hiring all these people to help us. And a lot of these people had lost their families. And one of the gentlemen who was living in the house that I was staying in, one day, of course we couldn't communicate, but he takes out a little tiny picture from his wallet, and through sign language and body language and expressions, he basically was telling me that he had lost, in a matter of hours, his entire family and everything he knew to be normal. You know, I think about him all the time, and I think about his face, which wasn't so different than this gentleman who I also met. And at the time, the organization I was working for was really worried about PTSD. Then we were like, okay, everybody probably has PTSD, and they wanted to send clinicians to treat PTSD, right? They wanted to send clinicians from the US. And I remember thinking, again, it was one of those moments where you're like, but is this what we need? Is this what people need? Do people need clinicians? Why are we medicalizing a very normal reaction to something completely out of the ordinary? So, needless to say, they ended up not sending clinicians, but at the time, that was something that was really coming up a lot. And I just remember thinking, maybe he just wants to go to the mosque, right, and reconnect with community and pray and recover that way. So I wanted to do more personally. I wanted to learn more. And after that emergency, I actually left the field of humanitarian aid and got more into development work. So we started the organization almost 20 years ago, and we've been working in Latin America, a region that's had been plagued by violence, right? I'm sure you've read about it in the news, you've probably met people, or you are from the region, and we have seen how this chronic violence and collective trauma really damages the social fabric. It like affects trust, and it also breaks down the very networks that you need for communities to be resilient. I mean, we've seen that in communities affected by violence, not only what I said earlier, that the way we interact becomes different, right? Because it's the sum of our experiences, the way we interact with each other, but what we're taught to fear, like how we try to protect ourselves, how do we deal with threats? So perhaps joining a gang isn't because I want to join a gang, it's because I'm threatened, so by joining a gang, I'm going to somehow be protected. So all of those things that are accumulation of our experience is what a lot of the young people in our countries face and deal with and manage. And many of them get involved in lives of crime because they've also survived violence. Many of you may have heard the expression, hurt people, right? And that's really important to think about when we're thinking about mental health and violence. But we've also seen the other side, the kind of the flip side of the coin, that how young people can come together or how they can make that decision to not vindicate violence or not perpetuate violence. We had a student that was really surprising to me, so many situations, but this was so extreme. He had just lost his mother to violence, and he was there, he witnessed it. And so many kids would have this reaction, a protective reaction that can become violence, right? To take revenge and avenge his mother's death. And in his case, he did the exact opposite. The next day, he just wanted to get back to his school. He wanted to connect with his mentor. He wanted to connect with his soccer team to just seek that support. And we've seen that with girls and networks of women and girls and mentors. This human connection really helping you cope, as opposed to perpetuating that violence. Or even young people that understand trauma be able to support other people, particularly their peers who are feeling hopeless or giving up or even like considering ending their own lives. So that flip side is what we think we can really perpetuate and scale. So both science and experience has shown us that healing the conflict within us can help us resolve the conflicts around us. So we can interrupt cycles of violence if we deal with the underlying stress and trauma by providing better access to mental health care. The problem is we don't have enough mental health professionals, right? Trained professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. In the US, there are about 300 per every 100,000 people. In Honduras, there are 2 for every 100,000 people. But what if we reimagine how we can do this? What if we reimagine who can be part of this effort to provide better access to mental health support? And we can, people are doing it, and this is happening. This is starting to happen more and more. We're so grateful we were awarded funding from the Audacious Project under TED, and this has enabled us now to train. We're training 100,000 to start existing government employees, so teachers, healthcare workers, police officers. We're training them on trauma education and also self-care, so they can recognize and manage the stress that they're facing, stress and trauma, the effects of that on themselves, on the people they work with, their peers, and also on those they serve. So we're essentially trying to create this whole core of lay mental health workers who are already serving on the front lines and can step in and buffer the impacts of trauma and stress on themselves, on their peers, and on their communities. We've seen in our hospital programs, and here you can see a picture of some of the trained doctors, that by intervening, for example, if someone's come in with a gunshot wound or a stab wound, we're able to reduce the likelihood of re-victimization by up to 30%. So aside from the human impact, we also reduce healthcare costs. We also know, we work with law enforcement, that police officers have reported 90% of them feel that they can better manage their emotions, and cope with kind of the anxiety, the stress, the depression. And 80% of them told us that they feel like they can also do that more for their peers. This is a picture from one of our schools, and where we've seen that just having that caring adult, I mentioned relationships earlier, having a caring adult figure, and this may seem like it's so simple, it's right in front of us. It is, but it's profound, and the science demonstrates how impactful it is, right? To have a caring adult in your life, and what that translates into. Not just the well-being, but also improved grades, improved conduct, school retention, resilience. So we're basically trying to saturate communities, right, with mental health support that's provided by regular people. They don't need to be clinicians. We don't need to be clinicians. So we're talking about community, and we're talking about systems change at the same time, leveraging resources that are already there. And I think what excites us the most about this when we're working on it is that this can be easily replicated and scaled, right? It can be replicated in almost any context, in almost any country. And also the people that you're training are also benefiting from the training for their own daily lives. The thing is that violence does happen between people, but healing does too. Right? That's where it starts. It starts between people. So the power actually lies in people and in relationships, in communities healing themselves. One of my favorite books, I always mention him because I love Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. I don't know if any of you have read that, or many of you. Yes. So, and I love this quote. He says, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. What we want to do is to flood that space in between stimulus and response with mental health knowledge, skills, and tools, so individuals and communities, so we can all pave our own way to healing and resilience. Thank you so much. Thank you to Randy, and thank you to everyone.